Hi, I'm Rebecca Bosch, and I'm going to be talking about a book by Ray Hughes called Sound of Heaven, Symphony of Earth. In the context of creativity and artistry, and how when heaven is released, that transforms culture. So I'm going to start by a quote by the author. Two things dominate the personality of a true worship leader. First, he has a fire in his heart to worship God that will not go out. Secondly, he has the same fire in his heart to see others worship God. So, yes. So, when I think about worshippers, I think about people who have really cultivated that intimate place with the Lord, where they've spent time with Him alone, and they really worship God for their own sake. When it comes to creativity and artistry and just the things that we pursue, it's usually because of joy and fun that we desire to enjoy these things. And so when someone brings their creativity and they express that creativity through worship to God, then this is where this beautiful thing happens, where God's presence becomes manifest, and of course we know that in His presence people are healed, physically, emotionally. There's healing, and yes, God just comes to comfort and nourish His people. So back to the book. Ray Hughes talks about David, and we know David was a wonderful king and prophet, worshipper of the Old Testament, and he was really considered both a priest, king, and prophet. And so we know that Jesus, of course, was also that. And of course, when Jesus lives inside of us, we also have the capacity to fulfill all these functions, because that's what they were. You had priests of the Old Testament, and they were allowed to enter the Holy of Holies and offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. We had prophets who were handpicked by God to release the word of the Lord, and kings, they were kings too. And so but when we think of, and so I just want to highlight the idea that David, yes, although he was all three of these things, he, the Bible didn't call him, his function wasn't, him as a worshipper. That wasn't necessarily a function, because that was his lifestyle. That was a common thread that wove all through his life. He was a worshiping priest, he was a worshiping king, he was a worshiping prophet. And so so that's just one thing we can remember. So going on, I'm going to just read a short passage from 2 Samuel, chapter 6, and this is where that David and his men are bringing the Ark of the Covenant, and he's worshiping God, he's praising Him and dancing naked for miles. And when his wife, who was the daughter of Saul, watched from a window, the verse is, when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. And then she confronts him, and then in response to her, he says, well, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, when He appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. And then he says, I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become, and this is the famous verse, 2 Samuel 6 verse 22, I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. So the interesting thing here is that he's not saying I will be even more humiliated before you and before the people, but in my own eyes I will become even more humiliated. And so I really feel like this is kind of a key for worshippers, because when we allow ourselves to abandon everything, and our ideas about who we are, our sense of reputation, and I'm not saying doing this, worship leading on a Sunday before the church, but just when we come to that secret place where we really worship the Lord in wildness and abandon, then there's just there's just power in that place. Okay, so I'm going to be moving on now to another quote by Ray Hughes that he makes in this book. He says, "The eye gate is as important as the ear gate, for unless we see what the Father is doing, how can we hear what he is saying? The foundation of the prophetic song is musically coming into agreement and accompanying what God is doing and saying." And so here, this is a beautiful thing, because when worshippers and worship leaders, more specifically, enter the prophetic grace, when they become essentially like prophets, then they are perceiving, the heartbeat of heaven, and things in the spiritual realm, but it's really about releasing the Father's heart, and when they, just like Jesus said, he's just about his Father's business. He only sees what he sees. He only does what he sees his Father doing, and he says what he hears his Father saying. And so we have access to come into that place as well. And so through our worship and our creativity, we get to really release, and we'll first experience what God is doing, and then release it into the earth. So I just want to say one more thing about just the connection between worship and the prophetic, and the power that it has to transform culture. So so the prophetic flows from worship. When we're in that place of worship, and our eyes are focused on him, we're enjoying his presence, then he speaks, and he speaks to us for our own sake, but then he also speaks to us on behalf of others. And so and this is also beautifully illustrated in Joshua in chapter 5. So Ray Hughes just kind of explains the situation where, so he says, "Notice how quickly a state of fear and oppression turned into a release of worship, and how quickly a state of worship turned into a release of God's instruction." And so this is Joshua, feeling inadequate, and he was, his fear, his lack of courage, he was able to still take that and release worship, and then as he began to worship and really abandon himself and his future into the Lord's hands, then the Lord releases instruction. And so this often happened with the prophets of the Old Testament, where God revealed his glory to them and they fell face down. The Spirit would say, "Now stand up," and as they would stand up, then they would receive the word of the Lord. And so this is really just an encouragement to come real before the Lord. Whether you're feeling negative, you're feeling grief, shame, whatever it is, it's about being real before the Lord, and then allowing that to turn into worship. So that's me. Thanks for listening.